so what happened is I would go through the whole presentation, and then at the end we would have an hour or more of give and take. They would ask questions and I would respond. So I think in that context, in other words, if you feed in that hour and a half after one of these talks, they got a pretty good understanding of what was going on, and certainly if they didn't, they could have asked, they could have clarified. And so I think for the most part they grasped it up to a certain point. I think the thinking now occurring is radical enough, again a phrase I don't like, it's essentially new enough that it's problematic for just about anybody. And certainly here I was dealing with faculty members who are academically trained, and these were basically philosophers. There were some non-philosophers, but basically people from the philosophy department, and therefore they all had their own specialties. There was a Kantian and a Heideggerian, this kind of thing. So they have a certain specialized mindset too, which also I think is not necessarily an asset in dealing with this. But anyway, I would say generally speaking it was well received, but I wouldn't say it was anything startling in terms of my perception of their reception.
Right, like they didn't completely get it. But
yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
Do you ask because it was a Jesuit college? And the impact, the impetus was hope?
That was part of what was in my mind, but it really was more philosophers who weren't necessarily great Catholic people or something.
Right. Well, the chair of the department, with whom I became very friendly during the time that I was in Baltimore, he had a pretty good understanding of thinking now occurring. He would characterize it. What struck him about it was what he would consider, and he attributed this to me personally as well as to the thinking, an openness, right? That was just kind of amazing to him, as how open the thinking now occurring is to, even though it's radically critical, it's nevertheless, this is one of the issues that Chuck brought up prematurely on the website, it does take seriously the truth of past thinking, right? So in that respect, I mean, and you'll see this in this book especially, I mean, in fact, well, I'll get to that today in today's assignment. I'm struck by a couple of things I say, even in the summary about, for example, Nietzsche. When I say it, it enables me to see how close. I've said it before, but it enables me to articulate more precisely how it's possible for thinking now occurring to be somehow or other in sync with nature, despite what you might otherwise think would not be the case. And then also in the body of the work, in the first part of the first chapter, I was really struck by another point of almost very important contact with Plotinus, which makes me very nervous. Okay? So, in any event, it's part and parcel of thinking now occurring not to be in opposition to, not in opposition to past thought, to be beyond it without being opposed to it, right? And to the extent to which it's beyond it, but not opposed to it, to that extent it has, as it were, plenty of room to appreciate what truth there is in the predecessors to this place we're at intellectually at this point in history. So that was one more serious and thorough, ongoing reaction. And the other fellow I should mention in terms of that faculty seminar was another fellow who became a very good friend of mine, but unfortunately also died while I was in Baltimore after about 3 years. And I think he had a very deep understanding of thinking now occurring, not so much that he could present it, but he got it. And I had the sense that even though he's coming from a very different orientation, there was a point of contact with his philosophical interest and approach and the thinking now occurring. So I don't think it was a waste of time to give the talk. So I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
I actually did have a question on page 2. Sort of a.
Are we doing Roman numeral or number 2?
No, Arabic 2.
Arabic 2?
Yeah.
All right. Wait a minute. Arabic 2? Oh, Arabic 2. Okay, yeah. Okay.
You make the point that separately existing mind is not rational, it is perceptive. And since the subtitle of Novitas Mundi is perception of the history of being, how does that square with your? Is there any adjustment to previous positions you've taken by using?
No, because
by
I'm talking
emphasizing
there,
that?
I'm talking about perceptive in a classical Greek sense, not by which I mean, it's a difficult thing, and it's part of it comes up indirectly in the analysis of Aristotle's, the particular analysis here of Aristotle's understanding of how the divine mind, in some sense, is in contact with itself. And what I'll say when we get to that part of the text is that Aristotle was working on what is an analogy to sensation, right? So we have a pretty straightforward understanding of what it means to have a sensible contact between the feeler, ER, and the felt, right? The table and the hand. And in that moment of contact, there's some sort of an identity in which I cannot actually distinguish the feeling and the felt, right? That identity of the knower and the known, and so that point of contact becomes the analogy that Aristotle uses to understand, to articulate how it is that the divine mind knows itself. It knows itself with something like the immediacy of physical contact. So, analogously to what I've just said, what's implicit on page 2, which I don't want to jump into right now, but what's implicit there is that the Greeks generally make that analogy. In other words, when they're talking about intellectual knowledge or understanding, in the broad sense of the word, they're always working off an analogy with what we would understand to be just simply physical perception. They don't mean physical perception, but they mean an intellectual act that is analogously an immediate the problem is that the language gets really complicated over several thousand years, right? So it's really not apprehensive, because apprehensive is a self-conscious word, right? It's more, as Augustine would often say, it's prehension. Right? Apprehension without the app. In other words, it's a kind of an immediate seizing of the object on the analogy to the way in which the hand immediately, as it were, grasps the table. I don't mean holds the table, but in being in contact with it, feels the table, right? So that's all that's to mean, right? And the perception in the thinking now occurring, in the subtitle of Novitas Mundi, that's something not unrelated to this issue, but it's something a little different, because that's in the context of the thinking now occurring, where this classical distinction between conception and perception, you say, is, how shall I say, essentially transcended, right? So in the thinking now occurring, perception and conception are identical, and so it's the same word, but in the context it's saying something different. Okay, I did want to go back over some of the issues that the preface raises, if there aren't any other questions at the moment. So on the first page of the preface, first of all, I point out that, I don't put it this way here, but in effect, I used John Paul's encyclical on faith and reason as a kind of hook upon which to hang the topic of the seminar. Although, as I point out in the paragraph, I was interested in his work, his encyclical on faith and reason, because that's what Novitas Mundi is all about. All right. So I was very interested to read it, and I make some use of it, as we will see when we go through the text. Although, I guess I should say, just as a general comment, I don't know whether John Paul II is the first philosophical pope. That can't be true. Could be, but I mean, he's very rare anyway for a philosopher as a pope. But his philosophical thinking, while it's personalistic and in that sense compatible with the thinking now occurring, he doesn't get beyond the identification of person and self, right? So from a purely technical, philosophical point of view, his own, if I can put it that way, his own intellectual stance, while it's not altogether foreign to the thinking now occurring, it's not fundamentally beyond modernity. I guess that's what I would say. However, his analysis of the history of thought and the relationship between faith and reason historically I think there are many good things that he says about it, some of which I'll refer to as the text goes on. All right, and well, then I point out in the second paragraph on the first page of the preface that in a sense, although this is a little bit misleading, but it is true as a methodological matter worth noting that while you have Novitas Mundi and you have Foundation, both of which are rather broadly presented, kind of broad. I mean, there's a lot of detail, especially in Foundation, but they're wide-ranging books when it comes to the thing now occurring and its possible implications and so forth. Whereas this text, at least in principle, attempts to narrow down the focus, so to speak, on the question of the nature of the divine mind. Right now, of course, as we know from Novitas Mundi and Foundation and other things, the question of the nature of the divine mind can be, depending on the philosopher, you could be talking in the most fundamental sense about reality, right? Not in every case, but in many of most cases. Nevertheless, that's the focus here, to see how the notion of nous, or divine mind in Western thought, has been impacted, as it were, by Christian faith. And to do that again, using in this sense the same kind of approach, although the details are different, as Novitas Mundi, starting again with Plato, with Aristotle, and because of Plotinus, Plato comes in, perhaps gets more play here than he does in Novitas Mundi. All right. Then chapter 1, which we're starting today, moves from Aristotle through Plotinus, then to Augustine. We just get to the cusp of its treatment of Augustine today, but you'll notice there, at least summarily, I'm saying that what Augustine's faith is then at the bottom of the first page of the preface is then shown to have provided the basis for effecting a synthesis of Aristotle and Plotinus by means of the notion of an actually knowing divine trinity beyond substance. Again, we're going to talk about this in more detail when we turn to chapter 1, but the notion then would be that if you've read today's assignment, you should get the notion that for Plotinus, the one, that transcendence of the all, beyond the all, that formless, I think, well, it's Dionysius the Areopagite, I think, who was a kind of Neoplatonist theologian, speaks of the Godhead as super essential, which gets you the feel of Plotinus anyway, whether it's technically correct expression, might be. But anyway, the point being that one is definitely beyond the nous, the intelligent God, the second God, as Plotinus understands it to be, and that second God would be, however, the analog of the prime mover in Aristotle, right? So and I guess I can take a little time just to say this as a broad principle, the basic understanding would be that Neoplatonism is, although it has the name Neoplatonism, and in some important sense that's probably correct, nevertheless it is a very creative synthesis of Aristotle and Plato, right? So it's not just, it doesn't skip over, so to speak, Aristotle, but it integrates and incorporates, although therefore transforming Aristotle, it nevertheless integrates and incorporates a good deal of the Aristotelian understanding of things and the relationship between actuality, potentiality, and so forth that Aristotle made quite precise, is integrated into a fundamentally Platonic framework. What the difference being, and this is related again to some of the little give and take between Chuck and I on the question and answer forum, is that if you're temperamentally a Platonist, you're looking for that one. You're looking for the source. You're looking for in the Republican terms, Plato's Republic terms. You're looking for the idea of the good from which everything, which generates everything, and which in Neoplatonism, that generation is understood to be a kind of emanation, right? So it's systematized and organized in Neoplatonism in a way in which it isn't in Plato, but Plato has that ultimate notion, which is taken with utter seriousness in Neoplatonism, that somehow or other, beyond being and knowledge, is the way Plato puts it in the Republic. And this, by the way, is very relevant to Badiou. because Badiou is by his own description, is doing a Platonism of the multiple, right? And what that means is that Badiou is excising the one, in effect, the source that we find in Neoplatonism and in Plato in different ways. He wants to get rid of that unified source. Say, well, if I go back to Plato's Republic, where it's pretty straightforward and simple, the idea of the good is beyond being and truth. Okay? So if in Badiou's case I take that out, all I got now, you see, is being and truth, but I don't have any unifying principle. So now I have the multiple, right? I have a kind of infinite multiplicity. Okay. Now but in Plato, the good is beyond being and truth. Now, what would that mean to a Greek? You see, well, we refer to the pre-Socratics as pre-Socratics. Well, what's the basis for making Socrates the Jesus Christ of classical Greek philosophy? Right? We have pre-Christian and Christian. See, well, we got pre-Socratic and we don't use the term, but in effect, post-Socratic thinking. Right? The chief among the post-Socratics being Plato and Aristotle. Right? So, what is it that Socrates does that wasn't going on in philosophy before Socrates? Right? There was a lot going on, as Chuck would be happy to tell you. There was Parmenides, but there was Heraclitus, there was Anaxagoras. What these guys were doing was that they were studying Thales, just kicking it off, right? They were all trying to find out what is the real, right? And what is the relationship between the mind and the real, you see? And broadly speaking, now it's a little more complicated than this, but broadly speaking, we would call them in modern terms, with a lot of qualifications, they had a scientific attitude, right? Not an experimental attitude in our modern sense, but they were interested in their ultimate, their horizon was the knowable. You see? The knowable. Well, when Plato comes along in the Republic and says, beyond being and truth, there is the good, which generates everything as the sun emanates, radiates life and light on the world, you see. When he says that idea of the good is beyond being a truth, what he's saying is it's beyond, in some important sense, it's beyond knowledge, right? And what I'm trying to say is, in the strict sense, it's beyond science. So here you see Kant turns out to be a kind of Platonist. That is to say, Kant distinguishes the moral realm, right? The realm of the moral law, the realm of human freedom, the realm of human reason for him, you see, from the realm of nature, and confines knowledge to the realm of nature, the laws of which operate by necessity, right? And will not speak of moral certitude as, strictly speaking, a knowledge in that scientific sense. Well, there's a precedent for that going back to Plato, right? That there's something more fundamental, or in his worldview, higher up, so to speak, than knowledge, than being and truth. So I'm saying the pre-Socratics were interested in being and truth. They were interested in knowledge in this rather technical sense, you see. And Plato was saying, yeah, fine, great, we're all interested in knowledge, not me, the least among us, interested in knowledge, but there's something upon which that world of knowledge that we are interested in, upon which it depends, and that which upon which it depends is the good. Now I said, well, wait a minute. So, what did Socrates? Right? So, interesting enough, although Socrates wrote nothing and would have really torn Plato's dialogues apart if he had a chance to have a discussion with Plato about all these things that he was saying in the Republic. Nevertheless, fundamentally, this is the influence of Socrates, because if you look at Socrates' famous apology at his triumph in 399 in defense of his carrying on and so forth, he spends a lot of time in the early part of the speech to the jury saying that the reason he got in trouble is that the only kind of wisdom he has is that he knows little or nothing, that human wisdom is worth little or nothing, and he's no exception to that. That's his basic attitude, right? So the famous thing, he knows that he doesn't know, right? Whereas all the other guys in Athens, they didn't know either, but they thought they knew. Okay, and that's not a way to make friends. Try that in your, in the office cafeteria. Forget it. Okay. So he made a lot of enemies for that reason. But if you read the latter part of the speech, he comes out with unqualified, what you might call dogmatic statements, that there are certain things he knows. And one of the things he knows, for example, is that no harm can befall a good man, in this life or in the next. Okay? So he has a kind of moral certitude, you see, which is not at all unrelated to his willingness to say that he doesn't have a clue as to what Anaxagoras is talking about. And although it must be very interesting stuff to study what Anaxagoras and, by the way, the sophists were studying, all these practical things, nevertheless, he doesn't have time for it because he's interested in himself. So in other words, Socrates is centered on the question of the good, about which, the reality of which at least, about which, he may have doubts about what is good in a particular case, but that the good is, he has no doubt about that whatsoever. Okay, and so that's the that aspect of Socrates. Socrates brings together, he brings together. I come back to Kant again. So in a way, he brings together in a very rudimentary sense. He brings together the strictly scientific or knowledge aspect of what we would call philosophy before him. He brings that, he couples that together, but in a way analogous to Kant that subordinates the former. He couples that with the moral concern, right? So the most important thing for a human being, for Socrates, as for Kant, you see, is to live a moral life. Even though in Kant, there's a lot more play given to the scientific. Yeah, Alia?
Good. So I have two questions. Forgot the first one, so
Okay.
I'll go to the second one.
All right.
With respect to what we're just talking about now, if the good is defined as that which is beyond being and knowledge, then the interpretation of no harm can befall a good man
Right.
is that nothing can be interpreted as harm. I mean, it doesn't mean like a rock won't fall on your foot.
Right.
Isn't that what how do you interpret that? Is there another interpretation?
No, I think that's probably right, if I'm hearing you right. Well, it's to say, you use the example of a rock falling in your ear, or drinking hemlock has a physical effect, namely it kills you.
Right.
So it introduces an important distinction between the physical reality and the moral reality, right? And what I'm saying in the case of Socrates and in the case of Plato, subordinates the physical or the realm of science and knowledge to the realm of the good and the moral. Right?
Yes.
So now that works very well for Plato. Now again, remember Socrates is very modest. So Socrates, in that same defense of himself before the jury, makes the point that while he's convinced, he has no doubt that no harm can befall a good man in this life and the next, he's not quite sure whether when he drinks the hemlock, he's going to go to sleep, and that's the end, that'll be it. Or he might wake up on the other side and meet meet Homer and all these other great guys in history, and that he thinks might be really fun because he'd get to talk to them, right? Because he likes to talk and have conversations, right? But the point is that he's an agnostic when it comes to the immortality, what we would come to call the immortality of the soul. So he is Aristotle's grandfather in that respect, right? For Aristotle, the immortality of the soul is minimally problematic. And the way Aristotle winds up, if there's any part of the soul that's immortal, it's the divine part, but that's not what we're really interested in when we're talking, right? But for Plato, the true me is this soul which is only temporarily, if I can put it that way, housed in the body in a kind of cave or darkness. So your question maybe, where I was going with that was that when Socrates makes this radical distinction and subordination between and of the physical to the moral, he sets up for Plato, you see, the notion that there is a kind of that the real realm, so to speak, is beyond the physical, and that's the realm of our genuine immortality. And then again, just because we did it in the seminar, I can't help but think about Badiou, you see, whose notion in his very materialized Platonism, his very multiplied Platonism, nevertheless, when Badiou talks about being enlisted, so to speak, in that subject that ensues upon an event in the truth procedure, what's he call it? It's the immortal, right? So it's not the kind of stable immortality that we associate with a Platonic universe, right? But it's the analog of that in the beginning of the third millennium, right? That there is something beyond, for Badiou, the animal being of man, the being in the flesh of man, and that's the true, right? And for Badiou, that's man thinking. When man thinks, he's beyond his animal nature, and he's participating in some kind of immortality, as for Plato. And then again, sorry about this. And then again, Badiou says, and of course, before you get into that subject, before you get into that immortal, before you are composing it, there is no issue of good and evil.
Right.
There is
Exactly, yeah.
physically, in the physical realm, the realm of science. So we ought not to be surprised. We have a whole tradition here, at least a Platonic tradition, that would not be surprised, and a Kantian tradition, you see, would not be surprised that science is amoral. You know what I'm saying? Now, of course, it requires a kind of Platonic dualism to maintain that position, but it's at least it's a position with a long intellectual pedigree. Right? Okay.
I remember my second
Okay.
question.
I thought it was the first, but all right. Don't worry
First
about it.
question. Right. Now it's the second one.
Okay.
So when you're talking about the good as a source, all your physical gestures and a lot of what you say indicates that the thinking was a point like the sun, or a source. It's like thought kind of that way. Whereas of course eventually where we end up in the TNO and in many mystical traditions, it's like the point, the source is a point, is one level, and the source, which is everywhere, is another level in the mystical stuff. And this is true of the TNO, obviously what we see, that if you think source, it's not somewhere. I'm not saying you think source, but
Yeah, but all right,
you're
go on.
thinking
No, finish your
source,
thought. We'll
it'll
come
be
back to that.
everywhere.
We'll come back.
Okay. What I wonder is it your impression that that was so for Plotinus? That the source was thought of as more like a point somewhere, a sun, as opposed to, like that was the gestures that you were making.
Yes,
As opposed to
it's
being
hierarchical. In
everywhere.
other words, as I go
Yeah,
up
that's what my
a
impression
hierarchy
was
of
to see.
being, I
Yeah.
come, as it were, I mean, I don't want to take it
Right.
literally, but as it were, I come to a point beyond being.
But also that
Right.
it's that everything is located in it. It is not located. He says that
Okay.
explicitly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But-
In that sense, it's not a point in
It's not
in
in
something.
some place. It's the locator of everything else. Everything
But
else
he wouldn't
is in
say
it.
it was, okay.
It's not somewhere. Everything is somewhere by virtue of being in it.
That's where the analogy breaks down. So to go back to Plato,
Right.
the sun, it's just an analogy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Plato doesn't, I don't think Plato means that.
You did say like the sun.
Yeah, and he says
He
like that.
says.
I mean,
Yeah, right.
he makes that, that's his basis for it. But the likeness to the sun, I don't think it's not a physical location. The likeness to the sun is the generative power of the sun for the things upon which it radiates its energy, right? And it provides both the being of the world and the life of the world. That's the way Plato understands it. And that analogous to that is the role of the one in. Right? So it's not a physical location, but that's the metaphor, if you want, or the analog that they're working with. It's not irrelevant in the sense that there is a hierarchy of being, right? But it's not a physical hierarchy.
Right, but it's thought of physically.
Huh? Yes.
Thought
Okay.
of physically.
Yeah.
Well, there is a series of containments, but it's more like a logical containment than it is like a physical containment.
Yeah.
The sensible world is inside the soul, which is inside the nous, which is inside.
Okay,
the
you
one.
could do it that way. Yeah, you could take your hierarchy, what Chuck is doing, and just pancake it down.
Yeah.
Right. Just flatten it out.
Chinese dolls,
Yeah.
Russian dolls.
Thank you. Okay, that's helpful.
Okay. What triggered all of that on page Roman numeral 10 was that when we get to Augustine, what I'm going to be saying in effect is that Augustine is influenced. I say here it's a synthesis of Aristotle and Plotinus. He's influenced by his Neoplatonism, or what he would call his Platonism. And he's very much influenced by Plotinus' notion that the one is beyond substance. Okay? And so when Augustine thinks of God in the Trinity, which we've discussed it in different contexts, although I don't think we've ever read the Trinity. Now, that's something we could do. I mean, it's a great book. But the point being that it's explicit in Augustine that God, who is not the one in the Plotinian sense, but shares with the one, that characteristic of being beyond substance, and so that's important. However, I guess what I'm saying here cryptically, and hopefully the text will elaborate it, when I say here that Augustine in some sense is a synthesis of Aristotle and Plotinus, it's like synthesizing Aristotle with the synthesis of Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle doesn't go away; he just gets more deeply involved in everything. That synthesis. What's the Aristotelian aspect? Right? In other words, the Plotinian aspect is going to be the lack of substance. We cannot properly speak of the Godhead as substantial. And by the way, that's agreed to. That's carried over by Thomas Aquinas, right? And by the way, both of them speak of God as a substance, but they're always speaking loosely. Right? God, it's strictly. They understand both of them explicitly that God is not a substance.
You're using substance in the way that substance is defined in the beginning in relationship to Aristotle, as a substance is that which exists by virtue of it being a something. Is that your sense of substance? That ousia is something by virtue of it being a specific something, by being it's having an essence, a toti and an I. It's it.
Yeah.
Is that the substance that's transcended? Because that is the substance that's transcended in Plotinus.
Yes, it is that. I'm tempted to go off. Yes, let me just say yes.
Okay.
We'll come back. I'm sure it's going to come up.
Yeah.
Okay. But I was going to say, well, what in this synthesis that I'm alluding to here would be the Aristotelian element, right? And the Aristotelian element would be that in some sense, now it's going to be a radically transformed sense, obviously, right? It's going to be the transformation of the Aristotelian element is going to be the Trinity, right? But in other words, the point would be that in Augustine, what we're going to encounter is a ultimate creator of the world, an ultimate divine being. Well, right there, who is being, and therefore who is nous in some sense. You see, who is an intellect, who is not beyond thinking, you see, in the way in which the Plotinian one is. Right? If I put it in the coarse and direct terms, not necessarily erroneous, just right. The Christian God thinks for itself. Right? It doesn't, as for Plotinian God, thinks for another. That's not even accurate, right? It's not that Plotinus' God thinks for the second God, but is the cause of the act of thinking in the second God. So in a loose sense, thinks for another. Does the work, but not for itself. Not that it itself should actually know or think, right? Whereas the Christian God, the God of Augustine, is going to have that knowledge aspect, that knowing nature, you see. It's going to have it in spades. It's going to have it as memory, understanding, and will. Right? That's going to go beyond. In that detail, it goes far beyond Aristotle. Okay? But nevertheless, that there is a divine intellect, that the divine being is an intellect, that the ultimate creator is an intellect. That's an Aristotelian, as it were, ingredient. Or another way of looking at it, if you just allow the hierarchical disposition a moment, when I go from nature to spirit or soul to nous to the one, it's as if Augustine, in a very creative way, is collapsing the one and the nous in Plotinus, right? That is, he identifying, you see, the intellect, which is really the intelligible world of being, you see, which is the secondary God. That becomes indistinguishable in Augustine from what in Plotinus would be the one, to say, which would be beyond that. No, that ultimate creator. Now, of course, we have to be careful. You raised the question about the source, and that comes up in the context of our reading, and it's very sticky, tricky business, right? And again, it's one of these very good examples in philosophy where the word doesn't tell you everything, the context is critical, right? Because John's Gospel is written in Greek, of course, and it says, "en arche." In the beginning, the word, right, you see? Okay, so no one would translate in the source, to say, although, you could, but you wouldn't, right? Because you understand that it's integral to the biblical notion that there is a beginning. So the beginning and the beginning, the beginning is the beginning, right? So is the beginning a ex nihilo type thing, you say? Or is it a derivation from an outflowing of, you see, something that is eternally there, right? So even though the same word, arche, would be used, the significance of that term is going to be radically different, but it can lead to all sorts of potential and actual confusion.
I mean, in Latin, is it the Latin translation? In principio.
Yeah, in principio.
So you have
the same kind of ambiguity.
Yeah, of course. But so it's in principle.
Well,
in the principle,
you could say,
there is the logos.
Yeah, but
arche that's the Aristotelian principle. An arche is correlated
or
to
the
telos.
principium in the Latin would be the equivalent of arche. But for example, on this point, the point I'm making is that if you read Augustine's text, when Augustine speaks of the beginning in English, if you look at the Latin, it's almost always in principio. To say, so in other words, he has no notion of the principium as the source. So he has a notion of this sharp from here on type things, right? Whereas the source idea, well, if you go back to one of the boogaboo ideas in the Thinking Now Occurring, source connotes continuity, right?
Right.
It a lack of a break, right? Okay. Then the second paragraph on page 10, Aquinas, transcendental form of natural reason and the likeness of the divine mind. We've talked about this in many different ways, but again, just by way of refreshment and maybe news to maybe Zarina, if no one else, the understanding here would be that in Aquinas, what we have, Aquinas takes seriously intellectually in so many different ways. He takes it seriously intellectually. Right? In other words, you have a tradition in which God created the world in His likeness, in our likeness, whatever, or in the image of God, so forth and so on. For Aquinas, that likeness not only is operative in his understanding of how the human soul knows things through the principle of likeness, but cosmologically, and this is working also in Augustine, same principle, the world is created in the likeness of God means that we can, if that's true, that means that we can, as it were, infer from our understanding of our world and our own nature, we can infer, as it were, backwards. We can infer something. It's not a one-to-one correspondence because likeness is not identity, but nevertheless, we can infer something true and real about the Creator. Okay? So, now there's a kind of dialogue going here in this phrase that I think I invented this phrase, transcendental form of natural reason, which I'm saying in Novitas Mundi and elsewhere is what Aquinas creates. The point I'm trying to make now is that what's distinctive there is that the transcendental form of natural reason, that is the reason of the creature, is in a transcendental form. That is, it is a form of mind that is, as it were, transparently related to its object, right? as opposed to the Aristotelian notion of the divine mind, which is kind of, I can't say, if it was Hegel is our modern Aristotle, the divine mind in the Hegelian sense is quite literally self-enclosed. You can't really say that for Aristotle, because Aristotle doesn't pretend to be in some sort of simple continuity with the divine mind, even a little bit of divinity within his own soul. But it is, as it were, in Aristotle, enclosed upon itself, if not self-enclosed, right? Get rid of the active sense. It's objectively closed and oblivious in Aristotle of the world, which otherwise depends upon it as prime mover for its structure and operations. You see, so the paradox in Aristotle is that I have this chief god, as it were, this prime mover, upon whom the whole motion of the universe ultimately depends, who is absolutely unaware of anything, as it were. Now we get where all these metaphors break down, as it were, because it's not a physical being, outside of itself. Or in modern terms, we would say the Aristotelian God is that mind has no knowledge of anything other than itself. Because, as he says, I think in today's assignment, when we get into the chapter, because it would be a derogation from the dignity of the divine if it knew something, if its knowledge were dependent upon or determined by something other than itself, or if it wasn't knowing at any particular time. Yeah. I thought you were going to.
Oh, no, I just said it's autistic.
Autistic. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, you could say that. I don't know. It's interesting. All right. Okay. So when, by the time we get to Aquinas, I'm saying Aquinas has a different attitude than Augustine when it comes to the natural world. That is, the modernity didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of an intellectual transformation that begins with Christianity, but it's significantly there in Augustine, but relatively undeveloped compared to what happens in Aquinas. And I think it's no accident. I mean, you might call it providence, that Aquinas, unlike Augustine, is at least formally an Aristotelian. Okay, so whatever Aristotle was operating in Augustine was transmitted to him, so to speak, through his Platonism, whereas Aquinas in the 13th century in Italy was getting at least the Latin translations of the Aristotelian texts that were coming in from the East, all right? So he had a direct access, and this was new stuff, so it was also, it was the hip thing, it was the kind of thinking, it was the latest thing, it was kind of, I don't say unimportant, but importantly coincidental fashion in thought. And of course, Aristotle, unlike Plato, has no certainty about the immortality of the soul. And even though human knowing, qua act of knowing, is a divine something or other in the human soul, it's not to be identified in any unqualified sense, to put it mildly, with the human soul. And certainly not with the possible intellect, which is the intellect qua human. Go back to Jim's calling our attention on page 2, which we'll come to back again. But in other words, the human mind, qua human, is not separate from a body, right? And that's what gives Aristotle the problem of answering the question about the immortality of the soul, because what he really doesn't think the rational soul is anything apart from being the form of the body, even though a part of it can be construed to be such. All right, so what I'm getting at is when you get to Aquinas, we have the beginning of the sensate world, as was it Sorokin, the Russian, the Russian sociologist, Sorokin, I think he came and went. Do you know him, what I'm talking about? Yeah, he has a great little synopsis of the stages of history, and there's the ideal sensate. The idea. Okay, so there's the age of the idea, which in the last 2,000 years, Sorokin, but you could find analogs of this in ancient history or other parts of the world. The age of the idea for Sorokin would be the medieval period, right, where the idea was it, right? In other words, not necessarily in a strictly Platonic sense, but analogously. Then the Renaissance would be the ideal, where now we're getting the idea in a kind of close conjunction with the sensible or sensate world. And then Sorokin's final stage, which is from which hopefully we can recover, is the sensate age, right? That's the modern period, right? In which, so we go from the idea through an ideal marriage, as it were, of the idea and sensible, and then into a world that's radically committed to the sensate level of existence. What made me think of that? Well, Aquinas is a guy who in effect is setting up this transition, right? That is to say, he is very much a man of faith, he is very much a man of the idea, and yet his Aristotelianism requires him to take, and in fact he actually overdoes it, as I think I've said in different contexts, takes seriously Aristotle's notion that even though there is a divine act of knowing in our souls, it actually is the actualizing of a possible intellect, which is the form of a body. In other words, that all our knowing, qua human, begins from experience. That's Aristotle's position, right? Thomas, I think I can say this in Thomas's case, he radicalizes Aristotle, interesting enough. In other words, for Aristotle, it's not only that all our knowing begins with sensation or experience of the sensible world, but it, in a certain sense, and I'll explain that in a second, begins and ends with that. That is to say, the reason why likeness becomes the instrument of human knowledge, that's a limiting thing. I mean, it's great because the likeness is real, but it's only a likeness. When I know anything, including the soul itself, this is the point of agreement between Kant and Thomas. Okay, Descartes, in that sense, is more of an Augustinian, more of a Platonist. It's a nice little game, right? So I go from Plato to Augustine to Descartes, but in the meantime, I can skip Descartes, I go back to Thomas and go over to Kant. You see, what did Kant and Thomas agree on? They agree on a radical limitation of the horizon of human knowledge to the world of our sensible experience. You see? And not in exactly the same way, but on that point, right? So that's more extreme than Aristotle. And we've explained that before by saying that for Aristotle, while all of our knowing begins with sensible experience, it doesn't end there because we do have this paradoxical divinity within us. But we have no such paradoxical divine act of knowledge within us if we are created ex nihilo by the one God who is beyond all other gods, so to speak, in some absolute and radical sense. All right. So in Thomas, then, we have the beginnings of this. I don't know where I was listening to this, but it's an elaboration of what I was pointing out in Thomas. So Thomas, when Thomas takes as a 13th century thinker, which in his world he would have been a medieval scientist in the strict sense of the word too, when he explains the Eucharist, we say that he takes very seriously the question about those appearances after the substance has changed. And he ultimately reduces the appearances to the Aristotelian category of quantity, you see? So the res extensa and Descartes didn't come out of nowhere. Well, you could also say, as I was listening to somebody discussing this, but Thomas didn't invent that idea. In other words, he may have invented the application to the Eucharist, but what I'm saying is that medieval thought was deeply into the mathematization, you say, of the understanding of the world, which is put to very good use by Thomas, and which sets up, you see, the possibilities of somebody like Galileo and Descartes and so forth, all of whom, not all of the modern philosophers, but many of whom were mathematicians, not by accident, right?
Can you say how that works? How the appearances of the Eucharist become quantity? How does that?
His problem arises from the fact that he takes as a matter of faith that when the priest consecrates the bread and wine, the doctrine, the faith says that, well, yeah, it looks like bread and tastes like bread and smells like wine, tastes like wine, but it's not. It's really the body and blood.
Changing substance.
The substance is gone. It's a totally new substance, but the appearances remain as accidents to that substance. Thomas then asks himself the question, well, wait a minute. Yes, the substance has changed. We believe that. But nevertheless, here we have now, if we think through what we believe, we've got a little bit of an interesting scientific problem. I could say these appearances are no longer being supported by their, how shall I say, natural substances?
There's
You
a
see?
discontinuity between.
Yeah, there's a break, which again is another link with Kant, you see? Who take the transubstantiation thing becomes the basis of Kantian metaphysics. So Thomas asked himself, well, wait a minute, how can I explain then just the appearances? What's the structure of those appearances categorically? And so go back to Aristotle.
Yeah.
And you keep talking about ousia. Ousia is the Greek word for substance. Okay, so substance is now changed. So substance, in the natural sense, certainly is not supporting these things. But they nevertheless cohere in some sense to our perception. So the world of our perception, implicitly, you see, is not destroyed by the inapparent change of substance. You see? Well then, what can I say about the world of appearance qua appearance? What can I say about these elements qua sensible elements? Well, if I go back to Aristotle, I've got some categories to choose from. The fundamental ones of which would be quality, relation, quantity, etc. Right? Position, etc. So in Aristotle, as Kant, which annoyed Kant, in Aristotle, the order of the categories kind of varies. He's not consistent. He's not a Kantian, so he doesn't say there are 12 categories. Right? That's what Kant did, right? And when Kant did that, he made the chief of the 4 categories, of which each had 3 divisions. The chief one was quantity. Okay, Aristotle never did that. And if anything, Aristotle would be inclined, if you had pushed him into a corner. I think it's fair to say that Aristotle, if you had said, well, I want to know what comes after substance. First of all, substance is clear. That would have been the first, right? But that's not the issue here, right? After substance, what comes? Now remember, all the ones after substance have to do with physical relationships. If you pushed Aristotle hard enough, he would have said quality. You see? So what I'm getting is, first of all, Aristotle never put himself in that box, but Aquinas puts himself in the box and explicitly chooses quantity as that in which the other categories, the other aspects of our sensible experience, the quality, the position, so they all, as it were, he says, inhere in quantity as in a subject. So in other words, quantity becomes for Aquinas the temporal, the temporal spatial analog of substance.
So
Second
modernity
God.
simply knocks out.
The second God.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, but possibly, by analogy anyway.
But in a sense, post-Cartesian metaphysics simply knocks out substance and replaces it with quantity.
Yeah,
extensive
that's
magnitude.
right. Yeah. That is our scientific notion of the substance of things is their mathematical structure and interrelationship, right? In principle.
Yeah, with a
Yes.
change in the notion of what quantity is, because quantity in the Middle Ages is not yet our quantity. It is the numbers are not abstracted to the degree that they are by the time of Descartes.
Okay.
You have numbers that are always much closely related to the things that they're enumerating. It isn't until 15th, 16th century that you begin to have the modern notion of pure number, pure magnitudes.
Okay.
So,
All right. But
yeah, no, I agree.
okay. All right. Then I make mention. Now, Descartes is going to be a very important part of this text, as we'll see when we get further into it. I give him kind of short shrift here, but the point I'm making, that the connection here in the second paragraph on page 10, between the relationship between Aquinas and Descartes, stated somewhat succinctly here, is that if you buy the notion that in Aquinas I have a transcendental form of natural reason, which is in the likeness of what I'm saying implicitly is the transcendental form of the divine reason. Do you see? That the divine reason, that mind, that Aristotelian-like mind that I'm saying is germinally there in Augustine's understanding of the Trinity, is fully developed on the model backwards to the reality of the creative likeness, or the likeness of the creator in the creature, developed backwards by Aristotle, by Thomas, to say in effect that human reason, the human rational awareness of the world, is the natural likeness of the divine original, so to speak. Okay, that's the way it's working. So it's a kind of simultaneous give and take. What I'm saying that Descartes does then, and this is I think this is essentially the case. I mean, it's really easy to do, but it's quite an elaborate process when you start down that road. But what Descartes did was, think about it. He went into the Meditations, and what did he do? He just bracketed the word natural in Leahy's formulation. And he didn't doubt that he had a, right? He didn't doubt at any point that his awareness. Right? In fact, it's because he's cogent. Right? He doesn't doubt he's thinking, and I'm thinking I am. Right? So what I'm saying, what does he doubt though? He doubts nature. He doubts that this, what I'm calling transcendental form of reason, is in touch with, as it were, right? Can rely upon its experience of itself as a natural being. Right? And in fact, by the way, speaking of Plato, he makes a Platonic move at that point. In other words, even though he's going to establish, remember this is the dualism at Descartes, right? So he goes into it, bracketing the natural aspect of the transcendental form of reason, and in a certain sense, while he restores nature to the transcendental form of nature, transcendental form of reason at the end of the Meditations, he does so in a highly qualified way, as a second substance. Right? As a separate substance from what I'm calling the transcendental form of reason, that now becomes a substance of its own, res cogitans, the thinking thing, which is wonderfully, miraculously joined by God, says Descartes. This drives Peirce up the wall, right? Because very unscientific explanation of things. It's in other words to say, I don't know how they're joined. That's first reading, right? Descartes doesn't know how they're joined, body and soul, so he attributes it to God. He says, even the medieval thinkers would never have done that, right? So that's arbitrary from Peirce's point of view. But nevertheless, that's the move that Descartes makes. So there's res extensa, which is corporeal or bodily being, right? The sensible world, the world of nature. We were talking about the mathematization of nature, you see. So that is the basis of the natural world. So he rejoins them, having separated them, but the joining is not substantial. And that dualism is played with in different directions by Kant. Then in the next paragraph on page 10, Kant's critique of pure reason, a refutation of the Cartesian argument. The Cartesian argument I'm referring to there is the foremost argument, which I won't spend any time on that now because it gets a lot of play in the text. But the foremost argument is the argument in Meditation 3, the first of the two arguments in the Meditations by which God's existence is established by Descartes to his own satisfaction. And he calls the first of those arguments the foremost argument, praeclarum, I think, praeclarum, the foremost or the especially clear, the especially powerful argument. And that, of course, is ignored by everybody, that, as far as I can tell, because of the influence of Hegel. Hegel was hung up on the what's so-called ontological argument, which is supposedly what Descartes is doing in the fifth meditation. Now, as we'll see in this text, I'm denying that, right? In other words, Descartes' argument in the fifth meditation is not an ontological argument because it depends upon what he explicitly tells us over and over again is the foremost argument, which is no way ontological. It's an argument, I call it an argument from causality. In other words, the only way I could have this idea, which I'm not capable of producing, if there is something that produced it, and it can only be produced by something to which it corresponds because it's an idea of positive infinity, and I have no such idea, says Descartes, as a finite being. And that to him is, I want to say, crystal clear, okay? And it's only because he's established that argument as the clearest possible indication of the reality and existence of God that he can then speak in terms that sound like the in some abstract sense, the ontological argument in Book 5. But we'll come back to that. In any event, what I'm saying is that here, and I'll say this more extensively in the text, in Kant's critique of pure reason, the way I'm kind of summarily, it's really a gross injustice to Kant, but essentially what he needs to do is in the critique of pure reason, Kant needs to deny the argument in Meditation 3, because there would be no Kant if he could know, based on his idea of God, that God existed. See? So in a certain sense, it's really not an injustice to Kant. It just cuts to the chase. The whole critique of pure reason is really a critique of the argument in the third meditation. Right? It's a rather elaborate critique of it, right? Right? But that's the whole issue. Whether or not I can rely upon the ideas of reason, or another way of putting it, whether I can go from the idea of reason to an existent. And I can't. That's Kant. I can't. Right? Now, Descartes thought he could, but son of a gun. Aquinas didn't think you could. Right? Aquinas and Kant agree. That's another level of their agreement, right? Okay. Then Hegel, in that second paragraph beginning on 10, the thought of Hegel toward the end of that paragraph, a synthesis of the Augustinian notion of contact of the divine mind with the world and the Aristotelian notion of contact of the divine mind with itself. Now that to me, that for me was a nice little discovery when I was doing these lectures. And I think it's quite true. In other words, again, I define this history of thought in some sense, it's not an exhaustive understanding, but as a kind of move and counter moves, right? And so, in order to understand Hegel, what he was doing, how he was able to do what he was doing, and so forth and so on, in the context of the history of thought, he takes what I say here in this line I just read, the Augustinian notion of contact of the divine mind with the world, all right, the incarnation. So and we'll see this, I guess, next time's assignment, when we get more deeply into Augustine. But in Augustine, the incarnation means, among other things to Augustine, the contact of the divine being and the divine mind with the world. It assumes flesh. There's a contact with the world. So the key word here is contact. Right? Go back to Aristotle. He just never becomes irrelevant. Right? So in Aristotle, it's straightforward. The divine mind is in contact with itself. Eternally so. What that means is another issue, but that's what he says. It's in contact with itself. In Augustine, the divine mind is in contact with the world. That's the incarnation. But because of his Neoplatonic heritage, where the one is beyond substance, you say, even though he Aristotelianizes, in my language, his Neoplatonism in the notion of the Trinity, the relationships among the persons of the Trinity, which are the origin of the intellectual relationships in the human soul, memory, understanding, and will, that mind, if I can put it that way, that intelligence, which is the creative intelligence, the aspects of which are the personal, are persons, right? That's where the mystery comes in. Okay, there's not a matter of contact there. That's what I'm trying to get. In other words, so his understanding God to be beyond substance, implicitly and explicitly, is that God's interior life is not a matter of contact, as in Aristotle, it's not a matter of being in contact with himself. Because you see what happens in contact's great, by the way. It feels good. The problem is it's a black box. That's the problem with contact, right? That was the problem in Aristotle. It's not a problem. I don't mind. If I was an Aristotelian and it was a couple thousand years ago, it'd be fine. It'd be great. Very good. But the problem with that is that I can't penetrate, Aristotle can't penetrate it, no one can penetrate that divine mind. Fortunately, because otherwise it would cease to be God for Aristotle, right? So the contact is at the expense of this, what I'm calling this transparent awareness or relationship with others, or other reality, or something not divine, you see? Whereas the creator God, if it's to be taken seriously intellectually, has to be related to something other than itself, namely the creation. Otherwise, if it isn't, then it becomes just the source of the creation, and the continuity between the creation and the creator is the dominant theme, and that we don't have, and certainly in any biblical sense, we don't have creation ex nihilo. We just have a kind of emanation or whatever, you see? Okay, so if we're going to have a real break, as it were, an absolute discontinuity between the creature and the creator, then we've got to have a transparency in the creator as intellect to that which is not itself, you see? And in order to do that, it's got to be open. It can't be closed upon itself, you see? So it has to, that's where the transcendental notion comes in, you see? That the transcendental reason of the divine being, or that the divine being is this openness in the structure, or of the structure of knowing, right? Which is applied by Thomas humanly in the natural form, and which, okay, all right. So,
Can I ask,
yeah.
Is this, I was kind of struck by this moving of the pieces, if you will, as you
Okay.
were describing it. Is that the Leahy version of the Cartesian clearest argument, that there, if the pieces have been moved, there has to be a mover, there has to be a player?
I didn't intend that, so I don't know. I mean, I can't say yes or no. Okay, so the point I want to make is that Augustine, therefore, has a contact associated, as it were, with the notion of the divine mind, but it's the contact of that mind with the world, right? And the Aristotelian notion of the contact of the divine mind with itself, right, is something different than that. And then what I'm saying here in this particular point in the middle of page 10 is that Hegel, if you want to understand Hegel succinctly, he synthesizes those two notions. So that is to say, the itself, when the divine mind is in contact with the world, as it clearly is for Augustine, but in Augustine, does not mean it's in contact with itself, quite the contrary. In Hegel, when the divine mind is in contact with the world, it's in contact with itself. That is, the world is itself. It's not, and so in Hegel, in some very deep sense, you see, we do return to the notion of source. You see, of a kind of, now it's much different. It's a much more dialectical operation, right? But the whole point in Hegel is that I don't go outside of the self-inclusiveness, the absolute self-inclusiveness of the absolute logos. I don't go outside of that to find the creation. That is an internal development, you see, which is the process of absolute self-realization in the divine being. The creation is not, or as I think I pointed out to you in the lectures on the philosophy of religion, Hegel goes so far as to say that the Father is like a womb, you see, and my response to that is, well, yes, the Father's like a womb, but in Hegel, the Father never gives birth, right? The Father is pregnant with the world, you see, but the world is not going to be, right, born outside of that Father. So it's an internal process, absolutely internalized process. Yeah.
It seems that there's an aspect of the Plotinian structure which is like that too, in the sense that the second, it's like Plotinus has really got two problems. He needs to separate the first in order to prevent the infinite regress, the third man. He also needs to separate it in order to guarantee the purity of the contemplative moment in which the contemplator has stepped off the intelligence. Its intelligence is led there, but then there's this other step. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that the first is not thinking. It's just, let me say, it's just that when we think of it as thinking, we are thinking of the second. And so, because there is that continuity, because there is an emanative structure between the first and the second. And he says explicitly that what is it that the second is thinking? It's thinking the first.
Okay.
Its contemplation of the first generates the forms. The contemplation of the soul of the forms generates the sensible world. So there's this continuous going back and forth between the levels. So it seems to me that you have that same enclosure and that same. I'm not necessarily agreeing with your attitude about it, but I certainly see the perception of that enclosedness in the emanative structure that then becomes like Hegel's position.
All right. So far.
Okay, I'm not.
Yeah. Okay.
Trying to be contentious.
No.
Just describing.
Okay. All right. Now in chapter 4, I point out here on page 10, Augustine's notion of the beginning of truth itself. In effect, the incarnation is proof form of the proportion found in Plato's Timaeus, as being is to becoming, so truth is to belief, becomes for Hegel, in light of his unprecedented synthesis of revelation and reason, the consciousness of the essence of absolute truth. That's just really a kind of summary of what I've led into in the previous paragraph, and we'll see more of that in the text. Kierkegaard is now in the position of the contrary of absolute truth, which is the absolute paradox, or an absolutely absurd position, which he takes to be the position of faith with a capital F, or faith, or Christian faith. All right, now, and I'll leave the rest of Kierkegaard till we get into it. Jefferson, and I think I bring together Peirce and Jefferson here on the bottom of 10, the top of 9. They are kind of, that's a move, now that's new, no, it's not entirely new. We have Peirce, Jefferson is new, I think, in this book, but we have Peirce in Foundation. Jefferson is a critic of Orthodox Christianity, put it, for want of a better way to put it. Or to be more precise, he might not have put it quite that way. In effect, that's what he's talking about, ecclesiastical Christianity. He's a critic of Trinitarian Christianity. And Jefferson, in his private, he refused to speak in public about his religious beliefs, but he's rather explicit, to put it mildly, in his letters, some of which are incorporated in this text, in part or in whole. He's very, it's no question where he stood. And where he stands is that Christianity, as he says, I think I quote him here, is a great religion. It's the best religion of all others, most friendly to liberty, science, and the freest expansion of the human mind. When it is taken out of the hands of those bastards who have been appropriating for their own purposes with a lot of mystagogical BS for the last 2,000 years, right? Jefferson's basic attitude, right, is pro-Jesus as a man, right? In other words, Jesus is the greatest moral teacher of mankind, and I think most of you are aware that when he was president, and after he retired on 2 different occasions in his life, he took a paste book and with his scissors, literally clipped out passages from the New Testament and pasted them in chronological order in his paste book, so that we have Jefferson's,
Just like Leahy.
2 versions of Jefferson's gospel, the gospel according to Jefferson, the key ingredient being that what he didn't clip out of the New Testament were all of those passages that had any kind of supernatural reference, right? So God, Jesus, at the end of Jefferson's 2 tracts, all of which is in the words of the evangelists, right? Exiles. Jesus was suffered under Pontius Pilate. He died. He was crucified. He died, and he was buried. Boom. That's the end of that story. Okay. So he's a human being like any other, and he has the greatest moral teaching, however. But what I'm getting at is that, so positively, if you ask Jefferson in his living room where he stood, he would say that he was looking forward to a time when there would be what he called a Unitarian Christianity, right? Meaning a perfectly rational reading. So in that sense, he was a deep. It's interesting. I have a question about whether would have read Kant. Yes. I just
Well,
don't know
would
the
he-
answer to that.
would
But
he-
he should have.
Was he reading the Unitarians, the British Unitarians that are
I don't
contemporary?
know. But I mean, he was very hip, so I don't know what he was reading. But certainly, he's a contemporary of religion within the limits of reason alone,
Yeah.
and that's exactly. Kant was laying it out theoretically in this text, and Jefferson was applying it with his scissors. Okay. So yes, Christianity is great as long as it's within the limits of reason alone. So let's just clip off this extra rational or irrational elements, and we've got the best possible religion, which is very friendly to science. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, is that available? What's the record?
Oh, yeah.
for that?
Oh, his
The
thing. Yeah.
Jefferson clipping.
It's in Princeton published it, and I assume it's still print.
Oh, okay.
Princeton University Press. I have a paper-bound edition. It's a thick book. Whether it's in a hardcover or not, I don't know. But you could certainly get your hands on it. It'd be worth having.
What's the name of it?
What's the title?
Oh,
Say if you have-
Jefferson. It might be Jefferson's Life of Jesus or something like that. But it's you'll recognize it if you come across it in bibliography. It's not hard to find. I may have it in the bibliography in one of the footnotes here. I'm not sure. I don't know.
I was just looking here at your index, and I
Right.
don't see Darwin mentioned.
Right.
Certainly in the popular mind,
Right.
Darwin is the alternative to creation ex nihilo. The many,
Okay.
right? So, why in a history of thought wouldn't we have some treatment of Darwin or Darwinianism?
But Darwin depends upon an evolutionary story that is not creation ex nihilo long before Darwin. Darwin's father, and all that whole
Well, that-
line of thinking
well,
was prior to Darwin. So
That,
Darwin is
that may be, but I'm talking about in the thinking that occurred.
Right.
Darwin's father and his uncle and his grandfather are not the issue. The issue is Darwin. Now, Darwin, of course, is distorted in many ways, I think. But I'm just asking, why don't you deal with Darwin or all of his cousins and aunts in this book, or in some, or does it fit?
I mean, I think I don't deal with him because he's not a thinker in the philosophical sense. Probably that's why I don't deal with him.
Well,
Now,
Darwinianism certainly is,
well-
is thought.
It's a
It's
Darwinianism.
a system of-
Darwinianism.
it's a glitch in the history of Platonism.
It's a philosophical. It's a scientific theory, despite the fact that it's religiously believed in by contemporary scientists. It's still a theory, and it may be an excellent theory.
Oh, it may not be. I mean, I think.
No. I'm saying even if it's an
I think
excellent
that-
theory, it's a scientific theory.
Yes, but to me, the cataclysm,
yeah,
the
go on.
cataclysm that we've had with creation,
Right.
the incarnation,
Right.
with the thinking now occurring. Maybe the thinking now occurring is more evolutionary than certainly creation. Who knows? But why wouldn't there be a footnote at least about Darwin or Darwinianism?
Well, it's my limitation. I can't do everything.
Yeah. But
However,
yeah.
in the larger sense, Darwin is implicitly comprehended in Peirce. Not that Peirce is a Darwinian in any narrow sense, but he's an evolutionist. And so to the extent to which, if I were looking around for what I would take to be a serious philosophical understanding of evolution, I would look to Peirce. Right? Now that may not be doing justice to Darwin, and it may be based on my ignorance, but that's why he isn't here. Now maybe in my next project I'll look more carefully at that. Unlike
You don't have to.
Okay. All right. What I say over on page 11. So going back to Jefferson. Speaking of Peirce again, the likely story, which you'll see, you can't fully appreciate it, not having read through the text yet, but in the Timaeus is the main character of the Platonic dialogue. Timaeus gives a likely story of the creation. the demiurge, I think we're familiar with that, right? The demiurge fashioned the world of our experience using the model of an eternally living animal, whatever that might be, an eternal model. He then fashioned the replica of that, and that's what the demiurge did. In order to do so, he begins with what Plato calls a receptacle. All right, so there's some place, as it were, some potential. You have to be careful here. It's not perhaps the same thing as matter, but it functions in a way like that. He has a place to bring into being these forms that are fashioned on some eternal model. The point being that when Plato goes through this whole thing, he keeps having Timaeus say it's only a likely story. And what I'm going to do here in the text is show how, if you that analogy that I mentioned earlier, as being is to becoming, so truth is to believe, that is an analogy which is in Plato's text. It's really a kind of, the Platonic mindset, it would be a kind of mythological way. It goes back to the analogy of the sun, right? The analogy of the sun tells us something about the idea of the good, but it's a myth. And Plato doesn't want me to take it literally, like I should go up somewhere to find the idea of the good, right? Okay. So analogously, his notion of creation is a likely story. It's a kind of mythological account, as it were, of the origin of things. Now, the origin of things, in this sense, again, it's not even if I would take the likely story as a guide to say there's no creation ex nihilo, right? There are already pre-existing elements, as it were, that are combined in right. There's, in my language in critiquing Badiou, there is innovation, you see, but there is no radical novation going on in Plato. And in a certain sense, you have the notion of arche again, in that sense of source, implicitly operating in Plato as well. Okay, but the point I want to make is that, speaking scientifically, when you get to America, you get to people like Jefferson who don't want anything to do with this kind of irrational faith, as it seems to Jefferson. And Peirce, who is a little more subtle about it, but also Peirce, you see, who wants to, not in any narrow self-conscious way, because again, pragmatism is a leap, not altogether, but a significant move beyond the self-consciousness of European modernity, that is the irreducible otherness of reality in American thought, which is absent in Hegel as the epitome of European thought. That irreducible tension between self and other in American thought, Peirce wants to nevertheless have, how shall I say, I was going to say, in his own way, he wants to naturalize or rationalize Christianity, but it's more subtle in Peirce than it might be in somebody like Kant. In any event, the point I'm making is that now that the creation is a likely story, translated into the scientific context means what? Well, there's an hypothesis. We can work with that. That's what a hypothesis is. It's a likely answer to my problem. You see? So if I want to understand my experience and that the world is created in the way that Timaeus says it is in Plato, is a likely story. Well, now I'm going to take that in a way more literally, seriously, you see, than Plato, who doesn't have that same kind of scientific mindset, you see, as I'm going to find in the modern context with Jefferson and Peirce. I'm going to be able to take that more seriously. And so I'm saying American consciousness is in some, as Jefferson's little comment there about Christianity, what's good about Christianity is that it's very, very friendly to science. Okay? And it's probably no accident, our fate in the development of modern science, not right? And that English, because of the American role, has turned out to be the international language, but not just that, most particularly the international language of science. Okay, so although I don't know how often we think of Franklin. I mean, Franklin was a scientist, actually discovered something. Right? Amazing, right? And Jefferson, in his own way, on a smaller scale, was a scientific guy. Right? Experimenting and all kinds of stuff. Right? Okay, so this is no accident, and the fact that our our Aristotle, Peirce, what was he? He was a scientist. He was a working scientist. All right. So, okay. So, I think I've mentioned you in a different context, but it's all relevant to what's going on, I think, ultimately in the thinking now occurring, by way of preparation, as it were, is that in America we have this ideal, not just in Peirce explicitly, but in the poets, Whitman and so forth, the at one-ment of science and religion. That's the goal in American consciousness. Now, knowing Peirce, we know that we're never going to finally get there, but that's the tendency, that's the direction, that's the ideal outcome. So that the break, so in that sense, we're healing, in American consciousness, we're in the process of healing that sharp divide, the Kantian divide between the moral, which for Kant is really what the truth of religion is, like for Jefferson, you see. But for Kant, the moral, true religion, and science are separate realms. And even though he, in principle, subordinates science to true religion, to the moral life of mankind, nevertheless, they don't interfere with one another. They don't merge. Right? But everything merges in Peirce. Being and nothing merge, well, then you can believe that science and religion are going to merge. Okay? And Peirce, in that sense, is just a spokesman for American consciousness at its deepest. All right. And so Emerson is a good example of that. We're going to spend some time on him later on in the text. Emerson is a good example of this. So he takes the Jeffersonian approach, in effect, you see, also a kind of ecclesiastical rebel, Emerson was. And he says, yeah, I got no problem with the incarnation. I have no problem with the Word became flesh, except that the Word is incarnate in everybody. Okay? And by the way, there's some good theological orthodox justification for that. Maybe not exactly in the sense that Emerson meant it, you see what I'm saying? But here, I mean, what the American consciousness does, because it's into fringes and vagueness, its genius is to smooth off the sharp contours, right? And to take a kind of intrinsically adaptable view of things, including an intrinsically adaptable view of Christianity. All right. Then I contrast, and we'll spend a lot of time in this text, so I won't beat it to death here, Nietzsche and Emerson, the irreducible negativity in Nietzsche that is not to be found in Emerson. Otherwise, they share a lot in common. Okay. I want to... again, I'm not moved to go into Levinas at the moment. So...
Just
all right. I think we'll move into chapter 1.
One quick word that the rebelliousness of Emerson is precisely against the Unitarian Church.
Okay.
That's his. He's trained as a Unitarian, and his movement back into all of this interest in all of the things that the rationality of late 18th century advanced Christian rationalism had developed. He's stepping outside of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the finding of the incarnation in everyone is precisely a move away from the limitations of that Unitarian view.
When you say that Unitarian view...
Well, the Unitarian view that would really the Jeffersonian view. It's really a rejection of the idea that you're going to clip off all of the spiritual aspects.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay. The issue of miracles, all of this stuff that preoccupied Cambridge theologians in the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century. Okay. He's saying next to that, there's this entire world of religious phenomena and experience.
Yeah. And then in that respect, he anticipates James, who had this high view of the so-called spiritual. Yeah. Okay. All right. It's quite intricate. Let's take a look at chapter 1, the creation ex nihilo, the Aristotelian essence. Those who are familiar with Novitas Mundi, we know that we do start with Aristotle there too. This approach is not incompatible with that. It's slightly different. What I want to emphasize here is in that second paragraph, quoting Aristotle's Metaphysics, the essence of each thing is that which it is said to be per se. I underlined in the Greek there the hekastou, the each, right? In other words, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that a real being is as we'll say a little bit later on here, is a this in the next, that which is said according to the thing itself is it's what it was to be. Further, the essence is an individual type, is the translator's version of that, which is the very thing, tada t, the very this something, the very thing that this something is ta t ein I. The very thing this something is, back to Todd's question about the watch, right? The very thing this something is its essence. Right? So its essence is not something apart from it. That's the key Aristotelian notion. Now, I'm not saying that's easy to digest intellectually. Aristotle's not easy in that respect, right? Because he's not really into self-consciousness, right? He just is committed to the notion that I cannot separate, as Plato did, right, in effect, the essence from this thing, right? Or another way of putting it is, there is no essence that isn't, I'll speak, individualized, right? That right? Now, the problem is, and this came up in one of these provocative questions that Chuck put on the question and answer forum. The problem is that one of Chuck's questions was to the effect, well, why can't, I think it pertains to something we're going to say on page 2, why can't there be in a genus only one species? Why can't there be one of a kind? You see? So I think it comes up in the context of the divine being I'm talking about it, but it would apply generally throughout the Aristotelian text. Why, if there is a kind called divinity, why can't there be just one member of that kind? One
God.
Huh?
One God.
One God, right, okay. The answer, the most direct and simple...
Sui generis.
Why can't it be such
Sui
a...
generis.
Yeah, right, okay. But for Aristotle, as he says, which I posted back to in the Metaphysics, he says, what we mean by general is something common to many, right? So by definition, for Aristotle, there is no, in Chuck's language, no singleton, right? So anytime I have a genus, I have a multiplicity of instances of that genus. That's the way Aristotle thinks, whether we like it or not, right? Now this, as I also pointed out, and it comes up again, if not in today's reading, yeah, I think it does come up when I refer here on page 5 to Hegel's impatience with Aristotle's particularity, with his not having a synthetic unifying principle, okay? Well, okay, fine. If I'm Hegel, I don't like it. Maybe if I'm Chuck, I'm not too keen on it. If I'm a Neoplatonist, I certainly don't like it, do you see? But if I'm Aristotle, I don't have any problem with that, because if I'm Aristotle, remember, I'm very aware, I'm very humble. Even though I have a little divine element in my soul, I am aware that I begin my knowing as a human being, as a possible intellect, as the form of a body. I begin with sensation. So in other words, and in that sense, he's scientific in something analogous to the modern sense, you see. In other words, Aristotle's a man who begins his intellectual operation by examining his experience. And his whole epistemology depends upon the notion, and this is his radical critique of Plato, right? Where do I get the idea of horse? Is there some separately existing idea of horse? Is there a genus? This is all relative. You understand? It's like form and matter. Genus and species are relative terms, right? So, horse is the genus for, Dalmatian, pony. Okay. So, my idea of horse, does that idea exist? For Plato, in effect, it does. Do you see? Whereas Aristotle, no. In effect, the idea of horse, what we might call the concept horse, is the form horse, is something that is found in nature, and I abstract, as it were, the idea of horse from my experience, right? So, where is horse real in the sense of existing? It's in these horses, right? And even if there were, I guess by accident you could say for Aristotle, because Aristotle is a man for whom things are true on the whole, all right, as we said very early on, right? Aristotle's not an absolutist, right? So, but speaking on the whole and in general, there are going to be many instances, and if by accident I only found one horse, there would be no horse apart from that horse, right? So now, in fact, in principle, I think for Aristotle, there have got to be many horses if this is an instance of a common thing of a genus. Then in principle, at least, whether I've discovered them or not, there have got to be other horses, either actual or potential. Yeah.
The extraordinary thing is
Yeah.
that, I mean, I like, there's the one thing I thought you did answer my questions, that if there is only one,
Right.
then in order for it to be a horse, you have to have an idea of the horse that's different from the horse.
Okay.
So I mean that's the extraordinary thing, that the idea of the single, of the sui generis, precisely recovers Platonism, and there's actually stuff in contemporary set theory in which that actually is argued. There's a whole guy who's involved with the question of singleton sets, and once you start focusing on the singleton set, suddenly you're back in the area in which suddenly you've got an idea of a set which is different from the member of the set, which would be crazy, since you think the one, if there's only one, that would be the place where the idea is gone. There's no more idea, there's just the thing. But it no longer, in Aristotle, it no longer has an identity. It no longer has an essence, if that would be the case. So what about the last member of the species? Never mind.
You mean the last? No, there's no last in Aristotle.
No, but I'm saying,
There's no beginning and end.
in our world, there are a lot of species that are having the last guy.
We're not talking about our world now. We're talking about Aristotle's world.
I know.
Because the world in which is populated by all these existing forms is eternal, right? So there's no beginning and end period for our ultimately. Things come to be and pass away as the materialization of the forms, but the forms never themselves come into being or pass away. And that means that somewhere or other there's an instance of this. Even if this horse is dying, there are other horses. For Aristotle to be put out of business, the world would have to come to an end.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Okay. But that's instructive. Okay. So he has no notion of this. Has no notion of this problem. Because I said this. It's very simple. Have you talked to your grandmother recently? Was she around at the beginning of the world? Did she talk to her grandmother? I mean, how many generations would you go back to before you got to Adam and Eve? I think it'd be an infinite regress. Okay? In other words. Right. In other words, everything by Aristotle in time, what he's saying is this, and Thomas points out, we believe there's a first moment in time, but hey, we're not crazy enough to try and demonstrate it. That's Thomas, right? Okay? Don't demonstrate. Don't try and demonstrate that. You're going to make a fool of us, right? We just believe that because Aristotle knows, and Thomas knows, being in that sense a good Aristotelian, there can be no first moment in time because the first moment, a now, is the end of a previous period of time. So any so-called first now would be the end of some previous period of time. That is, there is no first now. And analogously, there's going to be no last now. Right? So this is, the eternity of the world is absolutely real for, but even though it sounds like a wild idea to us, because we now got a science that's kind of aping faith, it's a perfectly sensible position for Aristotle to take. You can't find anybody who was there at the beginning. Try as you might. Right, okay. So you can make up some nice stories about the beginning. But I mean, actually, our experience, whether we like it or not, is we came into the world. Heidegger, runs with this idea, right? So we're thrown into a world. The world, in that sense, is always there ahead of us in our experience, right?
You know what Eve said to Adam when he got home late?
I can't remember.
Who were you with? And Adam said, there is nobody. So anyhow, they go to bed, and later on, he feels this thing. What are you doing? And she says, I'm counting your ribs.
All right, so what's being emphasized here on page 1 is again, however difficult it is for us to digest it intellectually, as it says there a few more lines down, that this belongs only to substances, that is to primary beings. You could reverse it. Primary beings, substances, are always a this. Right? But something primary is something that is not predicated of another. Hence, says Aristotle, essence will belong to nothing except species of a genus, but to these only. For these are not predicated according to participation or affection, nor as an accident. Dropping down a couple of more lines, each individual thing is the one and the same with its essence. So, I mean, that could be, it's hard to be more direct than that in Aristotle. To have knowledge of the individual is to have knowledge of its essence. So an individual thing is its essence. The thing and its essence are identical. The species or essence is said without qualification or properly only of an existing thing. All right. Then I quote Ross at the bottom of that page, who points out that rational and animal, in the definition of man, are not two different things. Ross says that Aristotle would reply in the bottom line that these are not others to one another, since rational exists only as an attribute of animal and has no separate existence. And then I generalize that to say, for Aristotle in the fourth line on page 2, there is no rational mind that is not the actuality of a body with the potentiality to live. All right, so yes, so in other words, in the genus mind, I guess you could say the first major division, specification of mind, to say, would be mind that is the form of a body and mind that is not the form of a body. The form of mind that is not the form of a body is not rational. Right? So what makes mind rational, what makes a rational mind, is nothing other than the fact that it is the form of a body. So rationality and temporality, which is related to one of the issues that Chuck raises on the forum, temporality and rationality are inextricably bound up with one another. Right? I can't transfer, just say, how can I put it, the qualities of a rational mind, of a mind that is the form of a body, right? A body, therefore, that is existing in a universe of time and space. I can't transfer them in an Aristotelian universe. I can't transfer any of those properties to mind, which is not the form of a body, which, by the way, to speak directly, I can't transform it to mind qua divine. Right? The divine mind, or divine minds, pluralized, because there's more than one in every genus. The divine minds, qua divine, that is, qua not being forms of corporeal entities, they don't have any of the qualities associated with mind, insofar as mind is the form of the body. Right? So now is an issue. The now is an issue for the rational mind, rational consciousness, we might say, right? Because it's the way in which our mind divides time. But an eternal mind, a mind which is not the form of corporeality, which is not associated with any form of potentiality, therefore with no form of motion or change, you see, we cannot associate that with the notion of anything related to temporality, including the now. So when Chuck raised the question on the forum about the archetypal now as perhaps being one way of reading Parmenides' understanding of...
well, now, because he does use now.
Well, he used the word now, but...
It's in contrast to having a before or an after. It never was, it never will be, it's all now. He doesn't say
It's
it
all-
always... He says...
It's all together now one.
One continuum, or one coherence.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay, but a lot depends on how we read that, right?
Well, but it's also that it's not. I mean, it's usually read as if the Parmenides object were something that always was and always will be, but it's explicitly not that. It never was. It never will be. It's altogether now.
I agree with that,
Yeah.
but okay. All right, I think we'll leave it at that. Okay.
I'm going to tell you, actually, I wanted to send this to you eventually. Manchester's entire book is about this.
Okay.
And it's a long journey
It's
to
coming out. It's going to be printed this book.
by Brill. Yeah.
Okay.
So there is no creation in that
No.
scheme.
Absolutely.
That's right, yeah, okay. All right, so I say there on this 8th line down on page 2, separately existing mind is not rational. Separately existing for Aristotle means immaterial. That's his way of speaking of a non-natural being, that is a divine being in effect. It is talking about perception. It is perceptive. It is, and then to make that a little more clear, it is intellectual perception, right? But again, the point being, in the Greek mind, the analog for intellection is our sensible experience, right? So when I see the tree, what the Greek understands is that that's the sensible analog of what the mind does when it engages in an act of intellection. It has an intellectual, as it were, vision, to say, of its object.
By the way,
But it's not a physical thing.
Speaking of that, you were talking about ousia earlier.
Right.
Is that related to parousia? Second coming?
Yeah, well, being, para would be alongside, second, being again, maybe being there, para, being beside. I mean, it's etymologically related. I don't know what to say about it. Okay. All right, so then what I want to emphasize here in that middle paragraph, the divine mind, dropping down a few more lines, is for Aristotle, where it says 1072b, the actuality of thought, which is life. It is the actuality there, the Greek energeia, right? So that's our English word energy, which comes from Aristotle. Energy, and by the way, it's a word that's used in spades by Plotinus, as we'll see in a moment, right? So actuality, energy, it's kind of the notion of a kind of affective power, I guess you could say. The actuality of thought, which is life. What Aristotle is emphasizing there is that the energy in the Greek, the energeia, the nous, energeia, the actuality, the actuality of mind, kainos, is zoe, life. That energy is what he's saying. In other words, the very, how can I put it, the energy which mind is, the actuality which mind is identically, that is what life is, right? So I think we said this in a very different context. A very interesting thing goes back to Homer, right? In other words, for the Greeks, there's no question but, and maybe this is why they are the originators of our scientific tradition, as complicated as that origination gets, and the working out of it, because it's clear in Homer and it's clear in Aristotle, here it's being very explicit, that intelligence and life, it's the same thing. It's the identical actuality, right? There's no notion in principle that there could be a life which is, how shall I put it, amorphous. You see? That it's kind of a blob, right? Right? You see? So when Crick and Watson discovered the double helix structure of DNA, now DNA, this is relevant to a little side issue that Hoth and I are having. We're getting into a thing about goo, right? And in biology, there's a lot of goo, right? And a lot of this goo is good goo, right? But the real point is, it's very misleading, because the reason Crick and Watson got the Nobel Prize was when they picked up this little gooey stuff called DNA. It turned out that they were able to understand that this goo had a structure. Right? And so if you mean by goo, in other words, there's no goo all the way down, right? When you get deeply into the gooeyest stuff, you say, it's rational, it's structured, it's intelligible, you say? And that would be most especially the case in anything that is alive for a Greek, right? Life and intelligibility, or life and intelligence, life and intellect, it's the same actuality. That's what's being said. So in that respect, the thinking now occurring is very classical, right? So again, we don't have to, it's not a question of leaving all the truth of the past behind, right? So the thinking now occurring wants to say that it's intelligible all the way down, you see? And maybe, as opposed to modern consciousness, it therefore wants to say, and the Greeks had a sense of this, that it's not, if it's intelligible all the way down, then it's alive all the way down. It's life all the way down, right? And that goes to the notion of the cosmic implications of the incarnation, right? That there's nothing but body. That these bodies are, as it were, parts of a larger body, which is the universe. All right. Okay, but as I say there, and this is what we've already discussed, but I just call your attention to it in the text, at the end of that paragraph, the divine mind must be one of a number of divine minds within its genus. And in skipping a paragraph, there is, as in every genus, a greatest of its kind, all right? So in other words, if there is a kind or a genus of divine mind, then there got to be, for Aristotle, a plurality of divine minds. And then again, for Aristotle, since the world is basically ordered, right? It's not going to be a chaos of divine minds, but there's going to be an order, and if there's going to be an order, we're going to go, in some sense, from the least to the greatest, right? There's going to be a greatest of its kind, and what I'm applying that logic here to is getting some logical understanding of the prime mover in Aristotle's thinking. The prime mover is the greatest of its kind. So it is, as I think I say somewhere along here, maybe not here, but yeah, on page 4, the analog, and Aristotle is quite aware of this in his own thinking, the analog mythologically or poetically would be Zeus, right? In other words, Aristotle had no problem with the polytheism of the poetic tradition, right? And he actually praises it as being a kind of mythological anticipation of what turns out to be true for him metaphysically. All right, so the fact that there are many gods, but that they are ordered in the sense of there's a hierarchy, as it were, of gods, and there's a chief among them, the most powerful one, Zeus. That's the poetic analog of the fact that the prime mover is one of many, but he is the most powerful. He is the highest level of energy within that genus. All right. And then at the bottom of that page, which I won't read through because we really just pointed it out, time and motion are eternal. May strike us as kind of paradoxical, but it isn't. That is, it isn't for the Greeks, and it certainly isn't for Aristotle, right? So in other words, there is no beginning and there is no end. There is motion, there is time, there is change, but there's no beginning and end to the totality of motion, time, and change. All right, and as I point out at the top of page 3, now one of Aristotle's other prejudices, since time and change and motion are manifestations of what you could say ontologically is potentiality, and the reality of anything is its actuality, right? Then potentiality is a kind of deficient state of actuality, and therefore the ideal being, of which the concrete instance would be divine being, is going to be being which is nothing but actuality, right? Actuality doesn't have to be absolute in the modern sense of the word, right? There can be many perfectly actual beings in a genus, okay? But each of them, which you see is no problem, because the only real beings are individual beings. So not only can there be a multiplicity of perfectly actual beings, but that each of them can be so as an each, as a this instance, you see, you could say kind of Platonic terms, perfectly self-sufficient in being, you see, not in that sense dependent on another being for being. And by the way, it helps if there's nothing but eternal being, then there's no need to try and account for the coming into being of these perfectly self-sufficient beings by definition, right?
So
now,
in the thinking now occurring, God would not qualify as the prime mover.
well, I'm not sure when you say not qualified. Would you?
Well, he had a potentiality, obviously, didn't he?
No. Who?
God, in the thinking now occurring. He became man. He became something. Became man.
Oh, and that's another question. I'm not sure I want to say that he had a potentiality.
Well, how did he become something?
I want to say
that he wasn't.
I want to say relying upon the influence of Plotinus on Augustine and Thomas, that the God who became man was otherwise than actuality. He was other than actual and other than potential. Thomas's way of putting that is that he is actus purus, he is pure act, in a way which transcends the Aristotelian distinction between actual and potential.
So whatever he became, it was an illusion then. Didn't become anything. He just
It's a non sequitur, I think.
became himself. Became what he always was.
No, he became something that he wasn't. He became a human being.
Right. And he didn't have the potential to become a human being.
No, he didn't need potential because he's omnipotent. You only need potential if you're not omnipotent. Or you only need not to have potential if you're omnipotent.
And you can't change. You can't become anything. If you can become anything, but you don't need potential to become that thing.
If you're the creator of the world ex nihilo, you don't need any potential. And the fact that you have no potential doesn't prevent you from doing anything you
Let me write
want.
this down before I lose it. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. Now okay. So on page 3, there's the classic definition of the divine mind. About a third of the way down in Aristotle's Metaphysics, 1072b. Maybe it's a quarter of the way down. 1072b on page 3. Thought thinks itself through participation. This is the translation. Through participation in the object of thought, or it becomes an object of thought by the act of apprehension and thinking, so that thought and the object of thought are the same. Now, in the Greek, in other words, reading that a little more closely, auton would be what's being called the same. I would rather say the identical thing is to know, and the mind, the knowing, are identical, kata metalexin, according to the, I think he uses the word participation, which literally is okay, through a participation in the thing known, okay? Now, if you break down participation, metalepsis, it means a form of well, we have it in our English version of participation, partaking. We say we partake in something. We take part in it, right? So it has that connotation of a kind of partaking in. So the mind, the divine mind, takes part in the object, right? Another translation of this could be communion, right? The relationship could be understood as a kind of communion, a kind of common sharing in common, so to speak, of a substance. Then he says, and this is the famous, one of the famous parts of this definition, it becomes, in the translation, it becomes an object of thought, noetas gignitai, that is, becomes that. Now here's what I want to focus on. Theganon kai naon. Theganon is the Greek word for touching, right? Or what I'm calling contact, right? So Aristotle, when he tries to zero in on the act of knowledge of the divine mind, he resorts to the notion of touching. The divine mind partakes of its object by a kind of touching, a kind of contact, you say? And it's that, so you could say, in a sense, I partake, I take part in the table by touching it, right? And at that, the key point here is that at that point of touching, the partaking, whatever, I cannot distinguish the felt from the feel. I can't distinguish knower and known. Sorry. So this is I think is as close as we can get to Aristotle's giving us some concrete sense of what he has in mind when he says that the knower and the known are identical. Right? They are identical in the manner of this, in the manner of contact, in the manner of touching. All right. And so I say, here is the heart of Aristotle's understanding of the actuality of knowing and being known. For man, the potential knower of all things, knowing occurs when it is identically the essence of the known. This act of knowing, all right, so human knowing, now here's the point, qua actual act of knowledge. Qua act of knowledge is a divine something or other. Qua act of knowledge, the mind, at the level of its actual act of knowing, is like the divine mind by itself, so to speak. It's identical with the known. It somehow or other is in contact with the known, but this to reason, you see, is what reason remembers afterwards it was to be that thing. You see, there's no immediate grasp by reason of its own actualization. You could say that the actualization of reason takes place beyond itself in Aristotle. See? And so when I talk about the transcendental form of reason, right? So then I would call, I think somewhere I do call that a kind of transcendent form of natural reason, if I could put it that way, right? Looking backwards to Aristotle. In Aristotle, the form of natural reason is transcendent. You say that is, understand, transcendent to itself, and in a certain sense, transcendent to itself. Whereas in the transcendental form, what we're saying is that contact, if you want to put it that way, which however is now going to be modified by Thomas through an intelligible species, which he understands to be a likeness of the thing itself, is nevertheless going to be transparent. It's not going to be a black box. It's not going to transcend reason. Reason is going to be, how shall I put it? It's a little too strong, but give the idea, as it were, self-possessed in the act of knowledge. It's going to understand itself to be identical with its object in a way that maintains the distinction between itself and its object, and that's the function of likeness in Thomas. You see, likeness, when he considers, he knows that Descartes is coming. He feels it in his bones. It's going to be a few hundred years, but he feels it coming, and Thomas says, well, maybe somebody could say that what I'm saying is solipsistic, right? You know, in other words, maybe this is the mind knowing itself, right? I mean, right? This is Descartes' problem. Thomas deals with that right off the bat. No. We know the intelligible species, the mind knows the intelligible species to be the likeness of something other than itself. Therefore, it knows that there is something other than itself, right? In other words, so likeness is a two-edged sword for Thomas, right? In other words, in knowing the object through its likeness, it knows that it's not it and its object are something else, and that's the beginning of this notion that we call intentionality. Right? All right, Aristotle knows nothing of that. All right, he's into contact, right? And in that sense, in contact, we have a kind of transcendence, a kind of darkness, as it were, a kind of what I elsewhere call opaqueness in Aristotle's understanding from a human point of view, from a rational point of view. There's a moment of opaqueness, which ironically, the opacity occurs precisely at the moment that the act of knowledge is. Would you say? But that experience is opaque to the reason, right? And we said last term, I guess, by analogy, it's very interesting that in Plotinus there's a certain kind of transcendence of nous in the one. Yeah? So that Plotinus gives us a kind of cosmic or metacosmic view of a kind of Aristotelian psychology writ large, right? That there's something above and beyond mind. It's not exactly the same, but it's an analog, right? There's something above and beyond that second God, that second God that in some sense escapes that second God, which nevertheless is, as Plotinus is going to tell us in today's assignment, when we get there, is that first God, which is the act of the knowing that is the second God. Okay? So Plotinus on a whole other scale captures a real analog to this problem in Aristotle. Yeah.
In both cases, the moment of contact is a kind of darkness vis-a-vis the kind of knowledge that occurs at the next level down.
Yes, that's right. Okay, fair enough, right. So another way of understanding by anticipation the transcendental form of natural reason in Thomas Aquinas, which sets in really with Augustine, I mean not that particular form, but the movement, is a kind of, what I said in different contexts, we'll put it in this context, a collapse between it, right? So now the act of knowing, which was above and beyond, and kind of a darkness to the lower level, that all takes place intricately at at the one identical level, right? So the act of knowledge does not escape what otherwise would have been the secondary form of knowing, right? In the human case, reason. All right. All right. So then I think I make here, so in the bottom half of this page 3, maybe about 2/3 of the way down, I say before and after the act of knowledge, both the knower and the known are such potentially, not actually. Now this is particularly talking about the human act of knowing, right? So in other words, for Aristotle, it's the old trick about if the tree falls in the woods, doesn't make a sound, right? The Aristotelian answer to that is potentially. Now that may not be very satisfying, but that's the real answer. In other words, of course, potentially it makes a sound, but it doesn't actually make a sound unless it's heard. Right? Generalize. That which I sense, when I'm not sensing it, is potentially sensible. And when I'm not sensing anything, which may not ever actually happen, but let's say consciously, when I'm not sensing something, I am potentially a sensor, you see? When I actually sense something, using contact as a kind of paradigm now, but it would apply mutatis mutandis to the other senses. Because remember, Aristotle says the most fundamental sense is touch. It's another nice touch of his. That's nice. Now I think of quantity. There's got to be a relation to it. Okay. So yes, there are a number of senses for Aristotle, but the most fundamental one is touch. Okay. So when I actually sense, I'll use his guide. When I actually touch something, my actual touching and the table's actually being touched, that's when that happens. Now the table is potentially touched, and now I'm potentially touching the table, right? So the point I'm making is that's so clear to Aristotle because that makes perfect sense, and he has no reason to doubt it. Why would he doubt it? Okay, that's his experience. Right? Now, however, what I'm saying at the bottom of the page, that Aristotle found it particularly appropriate to use the analogy to sensible contact in describing the eternal actuality of the divine knowing itself, provides us an insight into how unintelligible Descartes' doubt would have been to Aristotle. The latter, Aristotle, cannot doubt the existence of a sensible world, which is not actual apart from its being sensed by senses, which themselves are not actual apart from the act of sensing in which that world is grasped. There's just no problem. Do you see? Now, that's right. In other words, Descartes' world or his problem presupposes, you know what he does? This is interesting. See? In effect, what he does, he sets up the whole modern project, of course, but what's really going on in Aristotelian terms? Descartes is assuming that what for Aristotle, the actuality of which cannot be in doubt is because what is the external world is potentially, it's a potential. It's not, I can't doubt the actuality unless I'm in contact with it. When I'm in contact with it, I actually experience it, so I can't doubt it. Right? So what I'm getting at is that, in effect, modernity is a kind of very interesting move in which potentiality, or what would be merely potential in Aristotle's world, takes on a kind of actuality.
The idea is that, in fact, that's this whole issue of positivism, is how to banish potentiality from the description of the physical world.
All right.
Yes, I mean that's the whole idea is that you want to get rid of modalities. You don't want possibility. You don't want that there should be anything that's potential. And the whole headache of quantum physics is that suddenly potentiality comes back into space.
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. So now I'm linking this in with other things that we've discussed there. Christian faith in the transubstantiation of the Eucharist has not yet sown a seed of doubt concerning the actual identity of the substantiality of the sensible and its being sensed. Right? For Aristotle, the sensing of the world is the substantial actuality of the sensible world. In time before, in actuality beyond, all doubt and certainty. Right? So the basic premise here, zeroed in on the transubstantiation idea, is that not only does the transubstantiation lead the scientific mind of Aquinas to explain appearances independently of substance, setting up the Kantian move, you see, but before Kant, it is already introduced in principle, a radical doubt as to the reliability of my senses. If I believe this is not bread and wine, but my senses tell me it is, right? Well, as a believer, I have no problem because I just believe it. But as a scientist, I gotta think about that for 102 years, and I think, well, wait a minute, now maybe I can't trust my senses. My senses obviously are not.
You could say
They
that
cannot be taken at face value.
the entire world of physics is the continuous again and again confirmation of changes in the substance without changes in the accident. Because in spite of the empirical basis of modern science, the actual empirical condition of modern science is that nothing is perceivable. Everything is beyond what you perceive. The DNA, that's a structure in a goo, the atomic physics, everything is something that's beyond perceptibility. So we live in a world which is like the world of transubstantiation in the sense that the substances are constantly changing outside of our ability to perceive them.
Okay.
We only have the construction of the actuality of the substances, which is a mental construction, not something that's perceived.
Well, okay, I think that there might be areas in science where that is currently true, but I don't think DNA is a good example because you can see, in effect, the structure of DNA.
Well, I mean, on a microscope.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Well, there are different degrees of it, but
Okay.
but the basic thing is that if you start, I'm just sort of like
Right.
fun following. If you start with the doubt that's created by transubstantiation, that it might be the case that our senses do not give us a true report of the substance of the world. You start with that.
Mhm.
Suddenly,
Okay.
you've opened up a universe in which the whole thing might be like that.
Yes,
and so
yes,
you
that's
need
right.
microscopes
Right.
in order to get some information about what's going on. You can no longer. So
Right.
that
Well, I mean, I think Descartes' doubt and Kant's follow-through would be kind of a generalization, and I think we're saying this on another level all through the thinking now occurring, that really modern scientific attitude is a kind of generalization of faith. That's the irony of it, or the implications of faith, right? In other words, this would not have been a problem when the Eucharist was in the tabernacle in the corner of the church or in the front of the church, when this issue was confined, you see, to
a special case.
Yeah, to a peculiarly special case that was grounded in miracle. So in that sense, Descartes, despite Peirce, he's consistent with his culture, right? In other words, when he comes to an insoluble problem of the unity of body and soul, he attributes it to a miracle, in effect. Okay, and to that extent, he's not all the way along, right? But once you demystify the situation or generalize the situation, then you've raised questions, right? Which nevertheless begin with taking seriously the faith. That's the point.
But in the scientific, from a scientific point of view, nobody's gotten beyond Descartes.
Are you saying that historically or autobiographically that the transubstantiation was what nudged Descartes into this new touchstone?
Well, I was about to say, I think that's part of it.
Is that accurate in terms
Well,
of
I don't know that he says that.
personal history?
I don't, to the best of my recollection, he doesn't say that. So I'm understanding why he had the problem he did.
Because historically, the only thing that evolved in the history of thought that would have
No, I was about to say.
was the transubstantiation.
I was about to say. Also, one of the problems that Aristotle doesn't have is that he's got an eternal universe. So he has no doctrine that tells him, as Thomas articulates it, that there is a Novitas Mundi, that there's a first moment, a first now. Thomas says, we believe there's a first now, but you cannot demonstrate it because he read as Aristotle. It's contradictory, or it certainly can't be demonstrated. I'll be more careful to quote it. Cannot be demonstrated, can't be proven. I guess you could assert it. But so what I'm getting at is the whole worldview, of which transubstantiation would be a kind of very intimate, particular instance. The whole worldview was that if I take seriously the fact that the world didn't always exist, that it came into being out of nowhere. Well, many people have had this anxiety, by the way. Well, if that's true, if I really believe that, what's to prevent it from disappearing anytime it feels like, right? In other words,
It feels like
Only Ray Bradbury.
Okay, but the point now, of course, built into the theology is that the assurance that God wouldn't pull a trick like that, right? having created is going to maintain it. Right? But nevertheless, the basic idea was that my whole universe doesn't have that kind of security in being, if I can put it that way, that it had in an Aristotelian context. Add to that, I mean, a few other things like the incarnation, transubstantiation, and so on. I got all of these things which I'm taking with utter seriousness, right? Western civilization becomes Christianized. All the best minds for 1,000 or more years, right? Right up into the scientific age. All those early scientists, 9 out of 10 of them were monks, okay? These were people whose whole worldview was a deep, serious commitment to the truths of faith, and they were scientists. So at some point, there's going to be an effect of their faith on their scientific attitude, right? And you see it already in Thomas, and I think you see it in Descartes. So it's a more. I'm making a more generalized statement. It's not based on anything that Descartes said.
I think the history, to actually, if you wanted to unparse the entire history, you'd have to look at alchemy. The history of alchemy in relationship to the history of transubstantiation would give you the details of this, where you could actually see it working itself out, because there is some kind of a connection there. I couldn't spell it out.
All right. Well, I want to get to Plotinus before the clock runs on us. On page 5, at the bottom paragraph, Plotinus writes in the Enneads, quote, "Thus we have one identical principle, the intellect, which is the universe of authentic beings, the truth." All right, so notice, in terms of the reference I made earlier to Plato and the Republic, the intellect, the nous, the secondary God, as we'll find out in a moment, is the realm of beings and the realm of truth. Right? So, and in Plato, beyond that is the idea of the good, which is beyond being and truth. Beyond this intellect, the nous, in Plotinus, analogously, is the one. All right. As such, it is a great God, or better, not a God among gods, but the Godhead entire. It is a God, but notice now, a secondary God, manifesting before there is any vision of that other, the supreme which rests over all, enthroned in transcendence upon that splendid pediment, the nature following close upon it, unquote. The transcendent one is that which works to the establishment of real being. In Aristotle, the divine mind, the eternal knowing, which is the active knowing of the act of knowing, is the life, which is the energy of the mind, which I referred to before. In Plotinus, the one is the energy producing the hypostasis of being. The highest form of which being is the now secondary God, whose compensation for the demotion is to include within itself all other intellectual beings. All right, so another thing I'm pointing out here, or trying to, is that remember, this is part of the problem in Aristotle. Hegel's problem in Aristotle, it was, by the way, Plotinus' problem in Aristotle. Plotinus complains about this in the Ennead someplace. What I've called in Novitas Mundi Aristotle's particularity, right? He just doesn't bring it all together. He doesn't feel any need to, right? Okay, as long as it's an orderly, intelligible arrangement, that's all we need, says Aristotle. That's all I need as a scientist, as a knower of a world that I'm experiencing. That's all I need. Lose the turn of my thought here. Okay, so when Plotinus raises the one above the divine nous, he doesn't just raise the one above the divine nous, but a corollary, a consequence of that is that divine nous, which had nothing beyond it in Aristotle, was one among many. But those many, as I was saying from a totally different angle a couple of moments ago, were all independent, as it were, beings, right? In other words, they were not really, they didn't depend for their actuality on the actuality of the greatest of their kind. They were all, and that's why there's trouble, by the way, on Mount Olympus, right? Because even though Zeus is the most powerful god, hey, I'm Apollo. Who are you? You know what I'm saying? In other words, so they had an irreducible dignity as gods and goddesses. You see what I'm saying? So they could brawl because it wasn't like they depended for their being. Right? And so they didn't confuse their accidental differences with their essential equality with Zeus, right? And that creates trouble.
But in Wagner, by the way, the fact that they all go down because they don't respect the structure.
Okay. Don't get me all right. Okay.
Right?
the point I want to make here is that, so the real point is that in Aristotle, not only is the nous, in the sense of prime mover, the chief god, but he has other deities beside him, so to speak, that have an equality in being, if not in degree of being, if I can put it that way, okay? But they're, in that sense, they're outside of him. You see, they're not included, there's no unification. Right? Aristotle says in this issue of genus versus species, right, that if there were a one of a kind, which he rules out, right, then any others would have to be that one. And Aristotle says that's absurd, right? Yeah. Okay. So when Plotinus raises the one above the chief god, to say the secondary god in his view, then he's Aristotelian enough to incorporate all the other beings at the level of divinity within that one. So that one now becomes the unified whole. And in that sense, you see, Aristotle would object, but in that sense, you see, the secondary god becomes a kind of one of a kind, right? Although, right, a one of a kind that includes, in a way which would bother Aristotle, all the other ones that in Aristotle would be outside of that god, right? So now the point of this that the raising of the one is not just an attitude problem or an altitude problem, right? It's not an attitude problem, but the raising of the one, and this goes back to flattening out the pyramid, flattening out the hierarchy to a kind of series of concentric circles in some sense, right? That the point being that the widest circle here is the one, right? That everything is included in it. It's a kind of paradox of circles, right? So the most indiscernible whatever in Plotinus is the most comprehensive, right? And the first discernible, but less discernible, let's say, than the physical world, the nous is inside that circle, you see, and the soul would be inside that, and nature would be inside of that, and so forth, and so on down. So as the circle gets smaller, right, in a certain sense, I'm going down, even though in a pyramidal sense, as I go down, the base gets wider. So it's the same. It's just a reflection of the yeah. Okay. All right. So. All right, so the other intellect, in emanating from the one, so in other words, now the divine mind, which in Aristotle had a very modest role as the chief among equals, if I put it in Homeric terms, you see. In emanating from the one, the all-encompassing divine mind has become a product of the producer, the form of all things emanating from the absolutely formless one. So that divine mind now becomes the all-encompassing of being and truth. It is all beings and truth. And Plotinus says in the next paragraph, this produced reality is an ideal form, for certainly nothing springing from the supreme can be less, and it is not a particular form, but the form of all, besides which there is no other. All right, so it is unique. It is, in the language we've been developing here, one of a kind. It follows that the first must be without. It follows that the first, the one, must be without form, and if without form, then it is no being. Being must have some definition and therefore be limited, but the first cannot be thought of as having definition and limit, for thus it would not be the source, but the particular item indicated by the definition assigned to it. If all things belong to the produced, which of them can be thought of as the supreme? Not included among them, this can be described only as transcending them. But they are being and the beings. Here you can see, I guess, the root of Heidegger's ontological difference. It therefore transcends being. All right. Okay.
I mean, this
Yeah.
you've got to do all day to spend on being and beings there.
Okay.
Because up above you just switch it. When you say first must be without form, and without form then it is no being. Being must have some definition. It's a being that must have some definition, and it's not clear why being doesn't have to have a definition. Must have a definition. And
Well, it may not be clear, but it's clear to Plotinus, right?
in that moment, except if you actually go on with these paragraphs, they get less clear as he goes on, and he has his own caveats about what he just said.
Okay.
I mean, he's going to say, I'm talking about what can't be spoken about.
Okay.
And I'm doing that only because I'm trying to indicate something for myself, because I need to do that for what is clearly a purpose of contemplation.
Okay.
Um,
Well, all right.
I mean, that's not the holy hush of a pious relationship to the unspeakable. It's almost a technical point about where you've gotten to the extremity of what can be said.
Okay. Well, I want to make another point here. That is to say, notice that in distinguishing the one from the nous, the reason he wants to distinguish it here is he wants to distinguish the one as without limit from the nous, which has got to have limit and form and definition in order to be intelligence and therefore intelligibility per se, you see? And so when we talk about this collapse of the two levels in Christian theology, where the creator God is an intelligence, then that intelligence is going to be, it's going to have the quality of the Platonian one, which is unlimitedness. You see, it's going to be, it's not going to not just be an intelligence, but it's going to be an infinite intelligence, or as I put it simply, it's infinite reason, as it turns out, okay? And therefore, the human reason over against that in Christian thought is going to be the finite, and you can see this working both in Descartes, right, in the Meditations, all right? He's a finite thinker, he says, and right, and God is an infinite thinker. And in Hegel, right, the human spirit is the finite addition of the divine spirit. So what I'm getting at is that Plotinus has a notion of unlimitedness, of infinity, but he explicitly disassociates it from intelligence, from intellect, from nous. You see? Whereas Christianity explicitly identifies the two. So the identification of the one and intellect, a little more, flesh it out a little more, is that now the intelligence that comprehends all things is without limit. Right? There is in the Plotinus already an intelligence that comprehends all things, all beings. He's already said that, you see? But it ain't the infinity of the one. So now we have an intelligence that comprehends all beings and it's infinite. Well, I think the universe is going to start expanding.